Hey everybody, welcome to Board Online, Board Offline. Today we're bringing you our fourth part in our Mage Knight instructional series. Now this will pretty much cover everything you need to know at this point, the four-part series. I do think at some point I will bring a fifth part just to touch on a few things regarding setting up the individual scenarios found in the base game. And then of course, as always possible, I'll bring another series to teach you how to play with the Lost Legion expansion, which is a pretty fantastic expansion. And while not essential, I would say that if you're going to get any expansion for Mage Knight, Lost Legion's the one. But today we're going to get down into the rest of the Mage Knight rules, which is for player versus player combat. Something I've actually never used, but I have now learned how to, and it doesn't seem as bad as I initially thought. Player versus player combat in Mage Knight just never appealed to me, I guess because it's such an intense experience anyway, just trying to beat the game itself, even when you have other players. But now that I've looked at it, it might actually be a good time, and we'll see if I'll actually incorporate it into some future multiplayer games of Mage Knight. So let's get down to the table. I'm going to teach you how to play Mage Knight. Player can invoke player versus player combat as their action for the turn if they meet the following conditions. They entered a space with another player, and they do not want to or cannot continue moving. Also, the space may not be a portal or a city. Also, the end of round cannot have been announced, and the end game condition cannot have been triggered yet. And also, the move may not trigger a rampaging enemy, so this would be illegal. If player versus player combat does occur, the attacking player is known as the aggressor, and the other player is known as the defender. The defender gets a chance to defend by either fully or partially playing their turn during the aggressor's turn. The defender cannot move or perform an action during this combat. When attacked, the defender can use any effects normally usable before their turn or in the turns of other players, for example, plundering a village. Then the defender has two options. They can either fully attend combat or partially attend combat. If the player fully attends combat, they choose to take their next turn in advance. First, they flip their round order token face down. As long as it remains face down, they cannot be attacked again. When it would be the defender's next turn, the token is flipped back up, but their turn is skipped completely. The defender may use a mana die from the source. They may use skills that would normally be available on their turn. After combat, they may play both special and healing cards and effects if they wish. And finally, they follow all the usual end of turn steps. If they don't fully attend combat, then they do not flip their round order token in this case and will be subject to other attacks from other players. But this does allow them to play their next turn as normal. They cannot use a mana die from the source in this case, and they cannot use their skill tokens unless they are usable on other players' turns, such as Norowas's Motivation. Also, when partially attending combat, the defender cannot use heal or other special effects when the combat is over. And as you might have guessed at this point, they do not follow the normal end of turn procedure. They do not draw new cards. Any unused mana tokens remain until the end of their regular turn. Player versus player combat has only two phases. The first phase is ranged and siege attacks. The second phase, melee attacks. Combat ends when one of the players is forced to retreat or when neither player wants to attack anymore. If neither player wants to attack, then the aggressor must retreat. During the ranged and siege attacks phase, players will take turns playing ranged and siege attacks, starting with the defender. During both this phase and the melee attack phase, the player playing the attack is referred to as the attacker, and the other player is the blocker. This is regardless of who the aggressor or defender is. When it's the player's turn to perform an attack, they can choose to perform an attack or pass. To perform an attack, the attacker plays any amount of ranged or siege attacks and special effects. As usual, these can come from cards, tokens, and any other source the player has available to them. One thing to keep in mind is that if the blocker is also the defender and they are in a fortified site, then the aggressor can only use siege attacks. So in this case, this range attack would be illegal. The player would have to use a siege attack or they wouldn't be able to attack during this phase. Once the attacker has played their ranged and or siege attacks, and we'll say this is nighttime, so this would be ranged attack 3 plus 1, so 4 ranged attack, the defender could then play any amount of block they wish. Keep in mind, many of the rules from combating enemies apply here, so efficient and inefficient blocking, all those rules still apply. If the attack consists of multiple elements, the block is efficient against the entire attack as long as it is efficient against one of the elements in the attack. Also, unlike regular combat, it is not necessary to block the entire attack. Attacks may be partially blocked. And here's a big important key difference to remember when using player versus player combat. During this phase, the total value of the attack is reduced by 1 for each 2 points of total value of blocks played. Essentially, the Mage Knights have the swiftness ability. So in this case, remember when I said ranged attack 3 plus 1 is 4, and this Mage Knight is playing 4 block. That's only blocking half of the attack. Now, if the blocker were to use an effect that would cause blocked enemies to lose swiftness, then the block will work fully at that point instead. If the attack is not reduced to 0, then the remainder is turned into damage that must be assigned to the blocker as usual. So in this case, 2 damage would be assigned. Unlike assigning damage in regular combat, the attacker gets to choose how to assign the damage. Also, unlike regular combat, the attacker has to have enough damage to at least equal the armor of the chosen target to wound it. So, in this case, with only 2 attack getting through, they could assign 1 wound to the Mage Knight or 1 wound to the Scouts. If Norowas had not used this ability and only 1 attack had gotten through, they would not have enough damage to wound either the Mage Knight or the Scouts. Other than those 2 differences, damage is assigned normally. If the attacker has attack points left over and they cannot assign them in any way, then these points are not used and they are not carried over. Once this attack is resolved, the other player gets to be the attacker, and it's resolved in exactly the same way. This phase will continue going back and forth until both players pass. The melee attack phase works similarly to the ranged and siege attack phase with a few differences. In this phase, the aggressor gets to start as the attacker instead of the defender. As usual, during the melee attack phase, cards may be played sideways to increase the attack by 1. And blocks in this phase work fully, reducing damage 1 for 1. Damage can be used to wound units and or the enemy hero, just like in the ranged and siege attack phase. However, there are also 2 other ways to spend damage. The attacker may spend 5 damage to steal 1 artifact from the blocker and put it in the attacker's discard pile. It's important to note, though, that artifacts may only be stolen in this way if they are in the blocker's discard pile, play area, or assigned to a wounded unit. Damage can also be converted to move points and spent to force the blocker to retreat. To do so, the attacker has to choose an accessible, safe space adjacent to where they are fighting. The attacker must spend damage equal to the unmodified move cost of that space. So in this case, to move Norowas here, Tovak would have to spend 3 attack. The blocker is then moved to that space, and combat ends. Under no circumstances will this provoke a rampaging enemy. As long as both players are still in the same space, they will alternate roles back and forth as attacker and blocker, just as they did in the previous phase. This will continue until one player is forced to retreat or until both players pass. If a player is forced to retreat, combat is over, and the other player is considered to be victorious and then may gain a certain amount of fame. Let's say Norowas was forced to retreat, meaning Tovak was victorious. If the victorious player is of a lower level than the one forced to retreat, they gain 1 fame plus 2 additional fame for each level lower, so in this case, 2 more fame. If the victor is the same level but lower fame, then the victor gains 1 fame. If the victor has equal fame to the loser or higher fame, then they gain nothing for winning. If combat ended because neither player wanted to attack anymore, the combat is a draw and no one gets fame. But remember, in this case, the aggressor must withdraw to the space they were attacking from. In regular combat, the player may play various effects other than attacks and blocks. Most of these can also be played in player versus player combat. Effects that target enemies, such as the shock troops effects here, can target the opponent's unwounded units during player versus player combat. However, these effects may never target the enemy Mage Knight. If the effect is from a red card, or if it is a unit ability activated by red mana, such as target enemy is destroyed if blocked, it has no effect against units with fire resistance, such as the fire golems. The same goes with blue against units with ice resistance. If the effect says to destroy an enemy, the unit is wounded instead. The armor value of a unit may never be reduced below 1. The special effects of blocks that affect blocked enemies may target any unit contributing to the attack, if there are any. If the effect is triggered only by a successful block, it works only if the blocker reduces the attack to 0. Also, for certain effects, the strength or cost may be dependent upon the number of enemies. In player versus player combat, this is the number of the opponent's ready, unwounded units, and units contributing to the current attack or block, +1 for the enemy Mage Knight. Effects that modify values or rules, such as ignoring fortifications, as you see here, last for the entire combat. Effects that prevent an enemy from attacking may be played when the player is blocking. In this case, the player chooses a unit contributing to the attack and deducts its contribution from the attack total. Despite this, the unit remains spent. It's important to realize the player cannot cancel enemy special effects or blocks in this way. Finally, effects that allow the player to skip the blocking and damage dealing phases of combat can be used to instead cancel any one attack. No damage is dealt for this attack, but the cards remain played or the unit spent. There you go, that's everything you need to know to play Mage Knights player versus player combat. Hope you enjoyed this video. Please go back, watch the rest of the series, look for future Mage Knight videos as well, and until next time, if you're bored online, board offline.